This session is on women on boards, and we have an incredible panel of women board directors who are seasoned, who are very accomplished, and I'd like for you to meet them. So on my right is Altagracia Gomez Sierra. Oh my God. Okay, I got it. She's got a rah-rah team, okay? Got it. Shh. Guys, come on. Ladies. Altagracia, do you have a nickname? Grace. Yeah, it's a lot shorter. Altagracia is CEO of a family-owned company, conglomerate, not a conglomerate, that's by its initial, PEO, in Mexico. Now, in family-owned businesses, we know this, usually the guys get the top role. Not in this family. She's very young. She is the chairwoman of the board of this company. So, yes. No, you know how families fight in family-owned companies? There was no fight. They just felt she was the best person to be the chairman of this it's several parts. It's financial, there are lots of companies within this conglomerate. Financial, industrial. She's the youngest person on the list of the 100 most important business people in Mexico. Yes. You're 35? 32. Oh my God. You could be my daughter. No, she's very accomplished. She's an advisory board member of Corporate Coordinating Women's Council, the Citibank Private Bank Global Advisory Board, and the Citibanamex National Advisory Board, among others. Okay? I thought it'd be good to have a family-owned company for the first time. We've not had somebody from that arena before, and also to have a very young chairman of the board. So, next, on my right, is Brenda Harvey. What is this? We hire rah-rah teams everywhere. So Brenda, I invited her to the summit in Basel, but something happened. At that time, she was CEO of IBM for all Asia Pacific. Now, let me tell you, Brenda's American. She got herself on the board of Nissan Corporation of Japan. They don't do women well in Japan. So to choose not only a woman, but an American to be on one of the top company boards in Japan is an honor. It means they felt she was top gun who would give value to the company. So, Brenda Harvey. Back to this side, Muriel Penico. Oh my God. I'm afraid to say your name. Muriel Penico is a longtime friend. Her first summit was in Greece years ago. And she said, "Where are the French?" I said, "Well, you're here, and Nancy Gomez is here." She said, "Well, that's just two." Anyway, with her efforts, we had the summit in Paris in 2014. She persuaded then the Minister of Women to be the host, and we had 1,280 who came to Paris. She was the former Minister of Labor of France who changed the laws. President Macron wanted that to happen, sorry, President Macron. But he said she's got to do it. It was not an easy job. Got a lot of threats. She did it. Before that, she was French ambassador to the OECD. Before that, she was French ambassador for international business. Before that, when I knew her the first time, she was executive vice president at Danone. And now she is on corporate boards. She's on the board of Manpower, Inc., and she's on the board of Galileo Global Education Group. Muriel Pénicaud. And on my left, someone a lot of Spaniards know, Isabel Ticino. I knew that was going to happen, so I figured I might as well say her name first. Anyway, Isabel has a long tenure with Banco Santander, where she now serves on the board of the company. Before that, before that, she was president of Cbel Systems, which is now Oracle Spain. Isn't that amazing? And before that, she was a member of Parliament, the National Congress of Spain. She ran out of things to do. That's when she became a banker. Anyway, she was also in the Nuclear Energy Board. Good grief. She was in the legal department of the Nuclear Energy Board as part of the group of government legal experts of the European Energy Agency. So Isabel Ticino brings multifaceted skills to board governance. Please give her a hand. So many of you know that what boards do is to provide oversight and vision and direction to companies. They're not the management, they're overseers of management as they implement, the plan, a general plan and a vision. Now, the challenges facing companies are what I mentioned earlier, like the first night. They're dealing with the repercussions of climate change natural disasters, climate change-driven natural disasters that impact on supply chain, on employees, on their production. So they have to deal with that. They have to deal with the digital disruptions that we've been talking about, these past 2 days. They could be disruptions or they could be opportunities. They're dealing with this changed workforce that we talked about this morning, that is evolving and rules for which we have still to deal with. So there's a lot. They're also dealing, if you're a multinational, you are in several countries, and conflicts have exacerbated your operations, your supply chain in those countries affected by or near where conflict has taken place. So in that scenario, to be a board director has become very complex. So my first question to each of you is, what do you think are the skills now needed on boards? I have to tell you guys, board turnover is not often. The average tenure on boards in the US is 9 to 10 years. In other countries, it's until they die, No, it's true. It's true. The board I was on, we had an opening because the guy next to me was so old, he died, So, no, that's just to underscore, there are not many opportunities for women. So the women you're seeing here are not the norm. I've shown you numbers in the energy industry. It's not too much better in other parts. So given that, what are the skills that you feel boards need? I'll start with you, Brenda.
Well, thank you, Irene, for that background. And you set the preface exactly when you talked about the role of the board as governance. And the skills that many of us have from operational roles or political roles are not the same skills that you have to use in the boardroom. They got you there, but now how do you effectively build on those years of execution? So I categorize the skills in two ways, as we do those core business skills that you have to have: financial acumen, understanding ESG, looking at strategy and execution. And then you have those behavioral skills, which are actually even more important now. We all talk about listening, empathetic types of skills, learning, curiosity, courageousness. But I think the one skill that's most important, we actually talked about it yesterday, Muriel, is the ability to ask questions, to listen, and to ensure that the ideas are coming out and looking at those risks, not in the same way as we did in the past, but as opportunities, as you said, in addition to threats. But taking all of these macro dynamics and actually seeing them as positive opportunities to go forward.
Thank you, Brenda. Can I just ask you a little question? So what cultural skills did you have to learn to be an American on a Japanese board?
That definitely one of the behavioral skills. And fortunately, in my wonderful experiences leading Asia Pacific, and I was living in Singapore at that time, but actually prior to that, in the mid-2000s, I lived in Shanghai and managed across growth markets, which actually included Latin America and Mexico, Central Eastern Europe. I spent time in Kazakhstan and Russia and Prague, and the Middle East and Africa. So I spent a lot of time listening, learning, being curious, and having a core respect for culture. However, understanding where there could be limitations from that culture. So I'll just share one of my concerns about going forward in the interview process for the Nissan board was, could I make an impact? Because there is a view in Japanese culture that women are more in the service to others versus their voice. And I will say that through the process, and it does include directors from France and the UK and others, but it was the CEO in my final discussion. His first priority was on culture. He recognized the value of diversity and inclusion. Inclusion is my really important word. and that's what I bring, that cultural inclusion and asking that question. And coming from my IBM day-to-day business, which, as you heard earlier, we are enterprise. We are enterprise focused. But when you think of Nissan or many other companies, our purpose is enriching people's lives with mobility. So this shift to people and that social impact, so important. And so all of the experiences that I could build on from my international experience is still very, very important. And I do think that was the differentiator. I actually lived in Shanghai. I lived in Singapore. I've spent many times in these countries versus just having a global role where I was global.
Great. Good answer. Isabel. Isabel, you've been well known in the Spanish business world for a long time. What board skills do you feel are needed now more than ever, whether it's a Spanish company or another country's company? What do you see that has changed?
My answer will be the same as the men, but I'm going to explain to you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this important roundtable, because it's extraordinary women that are seen from yesterday here. Secondly, congratulations, Irene. I told you in private, but I need to say in public. The work Irene is doing for so many years is incredible, and we need to thank you because you put the visibility of all of the women over the world so high that thank you very much indeed.
And thank you in turn.
So now let me go to Spanish because we are in Madrid, we are in Spain, and I feel comfortable speaking in Spanish. I apologize for the people that don't understand so much Spanish. Estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que ha dicho Brenda, pero primero he de decirte que esta mesa es realmente importante porque, como tú muy bien has dicho, el mundo ha cambiado.
Sí.
Yo lo que estoy viendo ahora, y de ahí las nuevas skills que necesitan las mujeres y los hombres, es que el riesgo más importante que tenemos que analizar las compañías a la hora de delimitar una estrategia es el riesgo geoestratégico, el riesgo geopolítico.
Yeah.
Como tú has dicho, afecta a todo, desde las cadenas de suministros hasta la nueva cultura de los trabajadores,
Sí.
absolutamente a todo. Por eso, mi tesis va a ser desde un principio que en vez de estar pesimistas de cuántas cuotas nos hacen falta, de cuántos años nos faltan para llegar, yo el mensaje que quiero trasladar aquí esta mañana es que todo va a depender de nosotras. Y os voy a decir el porqué. Para estar en un consejo de administración, para ser directivas como lo están siendo estas extraordinarias mujeres y todas las que podíais estar aquí, aunque estéis ahí sentadas, y es lo siguiente. Yo pongo un primer listón muy importante porque estamos en un Global Summit. Lo primero que tenemos que reclamar las mujeres es la igualdad legal. Y aquí habrá países, a lo mejor, tú lo sabes, Irene, que has trabajado mucho, que todavía sus mujeres no tienen la igualdad legal. Y una vez que consigamos la igualdad legal, España la tiene hace ya más de 50 años, yo que tengo muchos años, viví los primeros años con discriminación legal en España, en la época de Franco, que luego hemos superado. Una vez que se consigue la igualdad legal, la responsabilidad nuestra es conseguir la igualdad real. Por eso mi discurso, tú lo sabes, Irene, está siempre apelando a la responsabilidad personal. ¿Qué tengo que hacer yo para añadir valor a esta compañía? ¿Cómo estoy de preparada yo? ¿Qué skills aporto distintas que pueden aportar otras mujeres? ¿Por qué quiero ser la directiva más importante de esta compañía? Y esa es para mí la más importante skill que se necesita ahora, en hombres y en mujeres. El conocimiento del sector, Irene. Es muy importante ahora, cuando los CEOs de las compañías tienen que tomar decisiones a muchísima velocidad, muy informadas, y que no había un rule book, no teníamos un libro de instrucciones para saber cómo salíamos de la pandemia, para saber cómo salíamos de la guerra de Putin en Ucrania, para saber cómo salimos de todo este embrollo que hasta a las canciones afecta ahora mismo, israelíes, palestinos. Los CEOs no son suficientemente capaces de tomar decisiones correctas para las compañías. Y por eso es el momentum, como tú decías, de estar en los boards, ahora más que nunca. Y ahora, en las skills que tú decías, necesitamos esa experiencia, esa gestión internacional. Blenda es un gran ejemplo, todas vosotras que estáis aquí, de gestión internacional, de tener experiencia de gestionar. Y luego, ¿cuánto tiempo estás dispuesta a dedicar? Que esto hablamos poco. Y un consejo de administración, tú lo has dicho, Irene, es una profesión muy bonita, pero una profesión de alto riesgo, con muchísima responsabilidad. Y las mujeres somos muy responsables. Y por eso tenemos que ser ejemplo del long life learning, estar permanentemente estudiando. Entonces, a mí me habréis oído, y soy políticamente incorrecta, que no estoy a favor de las cuotas, porque no nos van a ascender por ser mujeres, por mucha cuota que haya. Nos necesitan las compañías por el talento. El talento no tiene sexo. No tenemos que ser las que más hablan en un consejo. Tenemos que ser a las que más se escucha. Que cuando hablemos se haga un silencio. Porque ya tenemos el talent branding nuestro y saben que cuando habla fulanita, cuando habla meganita, esta no va a decir nada. Pero ojo, cuando habla esta otra, que nos va a poner la cara colorada. Entonces, yo soy muy partidaria de la responsabilidad personal. ¿Cuánto estoy dispuesto a estudiar? ¿Cuánto estoy dispuesto a leer? ¿Cuánto tiempo puedo dedicar a este consejo? Os aseguro, y yo soy de las mayores, por no decir la mayor, de todas las que estáis aquí hoy sentadas, que la experiencia mía, yo he empezado a trabajar en la época de Franco.
I know. I wanted to ask you, what is the difference between working on a board now, because you have been on other boards, from the time earlier when you also were on the boards of other companies?
Lo más importante es que ahora se da importancia a los boards. Yo pasé la primera crisis financiera, estando ya en un board, en el Banco de Santander, y entonces los consejos de administración, no sé vuestra experiencia, en España no eran tan importantes. Lo cocía el management y te convocaban de vez en cuando para contarte qué habían decidido. Eso era la primera crisis financiera. Cuando llegó la pandemia, yo presidía 2 comisiones de auditoría en distintos consejos, todos los días, todas las semanas, para analizar, y empezamos con el teletrabajo, acordaros. O sea, la mayor diferencia es que ahora contamos, ahora se ha profesionalizado los consejos de administración y por eso son más exigentes en las skills. Y es el momento para las mujeres porque las skills son nuevas para todos. Es nuestro momentum, no os olvidéis. Este siglo XXI es el siglo de las mujeres porque vamos a ser las más preparadas, las más capacitadas y, como dice Irene, las que más tiempo vivimos.
I think that is an important distinction, is the professionalization of board directorship. Because there was a time when, well, I remember I asked somebody on my board, how did you get here? And he said, well, Jim thought it might be an interesting thing for me to do. How did you get here? Well, Tom and I were golfing one day. Right.
I'm the customs, I'm one.
So what it takes for women to get on boards when you're not part of those networks requires a lot. Now, Muriel, you were on the boards of French companies, and now you're on the board of a multinational. Aside from the question on what are the most important board skills now, what differences did you and I talked about this at some point, what differences do you see between having been on a French board and now on an international American board?
First, have been on international board, but in French company. I was on the board of Orange, sharing the governance and the ESG committee. And then now I'm in an American company. But time has changed too. So partly it's differently managed, and partly time has changed. And the skills required today and tomorrow, for me, are not exactly the same than when I started 10 years ago. But before I would like to speak of skills, I would like to question the question a moment by telling you something. When the law Copé-Zimmermann, the Copé-Zimmermann Act in France,
it's the law that created quotas.
That created the quota of 40% of women on boards in France. Of course, all companies say there are no women, we will not find them, but as it was an obligation, headhunters decided to look for the first time at women, and guess what? They found a lot that were ready. So that was the first step. But then the women, and I was in the first group, decided that thought that they won't be able, that they were not legitimate. They had to have the skills, and they asked for director training. You know what? It didn't exist before. No man never asked to be trained to be a director before.
Good point.
So what happened? Women be trained, working hard, as you said, because they really read the documents, not play, but act. And so very quickly, the women have started to ask very accurate questions in boards. So from one side, the management sometimes was bothered with women with their good question, but we are just to present and please applaud what we are doing. But now we are such in a moment of continuous crisis that it's very securing for the management to be supported, advised, but also challenged by members of the board that are really working, have a real view, go in depth. And it's why it's very interesting in France now, 10 years after this law, the quota is 40% minimum, but we have 46 because the company value the vision of women now. So, but it's interesting that the question of skills only here we ask the question. They don't ask that. So saying that, the difference between US and French-led global companies, clearly the regulations are different. The number of lawyers involved in US is much higher than in France. And by the way, in both cases, you have the same challenges. It's really to have a diverse board, starting by nationalities, genders, and inclusivity. And it's very funny because I was in a global boards, but from French company. Now I'm in the minority. We're only 2 European in a board of 10 people. All other are American, knowing that the biggest part of the business is in Europe. So it's I'm in the reverse situation that I was a few years ago. And I think it's very interesting. First, it's always very interesting from a cultural standpoint. But also the fact that probably it's more formal in US, but at the same time, they ask more, and I think it's good. For instance, never go in a board where you are 25 people. Except if you chair a committee, your impact will be 0. In the board I have, both cases I've accepted because we are 10, and we have a real strategic role of challenging, advising, supporting the management. On the skills, I would say what is new now, because it was not so important 10 years ago, is really, as I said, and yesterday and Brenda mentioned that, the ability to ask the right questions. Because the future will be so different. So it's good to know the past. You have to know the past. You have to know the business model. You have to know the industry. But when you have been a CEO too, so when you are in the CEO shoes, you have to deal with the day-to-day business. And sometimes you lose the time and the capacity to open 360 degrees your view and to be challenged from a future perspective, not from a past, even successful perspective. It's very difficult to do the two in the same head. So I think it's why today the board have a mission also to ask the right question, to open the windows, to help to have a 360 degrees views. For instance, with AI, there are a lot of business models that are going to change. Not only transforming the business model, maybe the value creation will be somewhere else. Maybe today you produce services and on products, physical products, and the value is there. And maybe it's the data you have about that will create the value. And maybe you are in an industry and your competitor will be Microsoft. You don't know. So it's really important for board members to have a diverse view. I'm sure we'll go back to this question, but also to be able to ask questions from a larger, broader perspective, because you have not only to secure the business, to control the business, but to help to find the right question, to build the right next path.
I have to tell you, my fellow board directors in this room, where is she? Regina Montoya. She and I, we were 4 women in a board of 21. And so what we did was to caucus. The women met. And this is where quotas make a difference. And to your comment about asking the right question, one of the men said one time, every time one of you women would ask a question, all of us, would tense up because, yeah, we ask the questions that the men are afraid to raise. The women have no fear because there's nothing behind them, of past practices. So, Grace, Altagracia, You are speaking to CEOs of vendor companies. You are speaking to CEOs of companies within the conglomerate. Did age ever become an issue with them? And if it did, how did you deal with it in Mexico?
So I chair a group that has several divisions, no? And one of its most known ones is we're the second largest producers of corn flour for tortillas. Tortillas pues, are the basic dietary but nutrition form for 59% of the calories the poorest people in Mexico eat. No? The other sectors, one of them has to do a lot with agriculture, agro. We do the largest storage warehouse deposits in Mexico, so we originate, store, finance most of the commodities in the countries. And specifically in those sectors, it is not only very uncommon for women to participate in financial sectors or in agriculture or in public transportation. No? We also have the only national brand of urban and suburban buses. But it is even more uncommon for young people to participate, no? Even at a very small level, at a farmer's level. So 80% of people in Mexico's agricultural sector are over 55 years old. So it is very uncommon for young people to step up because they don't find it sexy, no? They find other sectors with more growing opportunities and whatnot. And so in my companies, which is, I'm the third generation of that conglomerate or that family business, I think transition or succession within generational succession happened very successfully, but also throughout a long period of time. So I didn't start here.
No, I know that.
So the way I came to be a chair is I started collaborating in many different areas, and so I was not calling the shots at the beginning, and so I don't think there was a problem with when I started calling the shot. I already had. I think that when you become a leader in any organization, whether it's a company, whether it's a political position, whether it's a social position, I always say you need 3 C's. You need to inspire confidence in people, on your commitment, on your ability to do things, on your knowledge on this sector. It needs to be convenient for people that you're there. For your company, it needs to be convenient that you're there. For you, it needs to be convenient that you're there. And then the 3rd C, I say, is something that is not taught. You need to have character. Character to face adversity. You need to have character to make your vision and your ambition match. No? And that is something the board does. No? The board kind of, and especially in family companies, the board is a special connection of roots, of knowing who you are, where you're from, and of wings, no? Of telling you where you're going to and what legacy you want to continue to expand. And so I think when you get there with these 3 things, but you have 2 main skills or 2 main jobs, which is representation and resolution. You need to embody the values of your company. In some sort of thing, you're aspirational, no? It's what people hope for when they look at the products, the services you're delivering in a company. And then you have to have the ability to resolve, no? To have, of course, this long-term vision for your company, but make sure also the short-term doesn't compromise the long-term. But also the ability to resolve things, the bigger things that are not in day-to-day management. No? What are the capital expenditures and what you expect from your growing business? Who are going to be with the next CEOs or the next managers? And what qualities do they need to have and what qualities do they need to embody? What are the values that are going to be pushed top-down? And so I think I was very lucky no, that even though these sectors, pues again, are not specifically tailored towards women or specifically tailored towards young people, I was lucky enough to grow up in them and to grow with them. And so I was seen pues, as part of the team since very young age.
So that was a credit to your family, but also a credit to yourself. I never think it's just luck. You had to have the character to understand representation and resolution are the key parts of being a leader. So let me just ask, there is this litany of challenges. Which one in your specific industry, Brenda, the automobile industry, is the one that is most concerning?
Uncertainty of everything is a constant. We've learned that the last few days. For us, in terms of achieving our Ambition 2030, which is about sustainability and ensuring that we're on that path, battery competitiveness, it's a constant, right? We have Asia with China, and we have Tesla. We have a lot of players in and out. It's changing every day. So one of that is within that uncertainty, can you continue to deliver on your business plan and your strategy? And I think the focus we have is, do we have the talent to deliver on that strategy? And it's assessing the gap of the skills. So we come back to skills of the understanding of digital transformation, understanding the importance of ESG, understanding how do we become more effective, how do we work within an ecosystem. So that's very important. In terms of one other element of climate is that we have manufacturing and partners all over the world, and this is being ready for those extreme events. So I'll comment, one of the activities that we had from a board was the Noto earthquake in Japan in January. And how do we come together first to be clear in crisis and in adversity of our people, of our partners, and of the community. This ties the company to the communities of which we work and live. And so being able to leverage our own products, EV and automobiles, to fuel or power through electrification, phones for people that were out, heat and electric, and work with the 200 communities around Japan, and we're extending that to Asia, in a true public-private partnership. So the answers to dealing with climate are not alone in a company. It's across the entire ecosystem, and being prepared for crisis. And we talk about IQ and we talk about EQ, and I think what we use is AQ, which is, I call, adversity quotient. So the ability to act, be clear, be concise, bring everyone along so that they have belief, trust, and you can pivot as you go forward.
Isabel, as Minister Carlos Cuerpo mentioned to us, Spain has ridden the post-pandemic economic recovery very well. So what do you see in the horizon that would trouble you as a board director?
Realmente España y la inmensa mayoría de los países, puesto que salimos con tanta fuerza de la pandemia que generamos una inflación absolutamente desconocida, porque era una inflación por primera vez no de demanda, sino de oferta. Estaban las compañías bloqueadas y nos encontramos con el problema de la seguridad. Cada crisis, desde mi punto de vista, tiene una palabra mágica que nos ha cambiado la vida en este siglo XXI. Cuando pasaron la caída de las Torres Gemelas fue el tema de seguridad por el terrorismo internacional. Pero por venir más cerca, cuando pasa la crisis financiera, descubrimos en las entidades financieras la importancia de la palabra liquidez, que no habíamos contado con ella para entonces. Cuando pasó la pandemia, entró en la cuenta de resultados el tema de la salud. Y ahora ya está para siempre en la cuenta de la salud mental, la salud física, el well-being. Esto está ahora en la cuenta de resultados. Pues en este momento efectivamente, cuando salimos todos desbordados hacia el crecimiento, la resiliencia para el crecimiento, yo encuentro que ahora tenemos unos riesgos que no teníamos antes y por eso está muy bien el salir deseando crecer. Pero hemos generado esa inflación que nos está trayendo mucho lastre en este momento. Todavía no saben los bancos centrales si van a bajar o no los tipos de interés. Y eso está haciendo mucho daño a muchas economías. Entonces yo creo que, por añadir a estos riesgos que tenemos que hacer frente en este momento, porque la pandemia quedó ahí, pero anda que no han pasado cosas después de la pandemia. A mí me ha afectado, no solamente personalmente, sino las compañías mucho más, el nuevo mundo que se está construyendo después de la división, tú lo has dicho al principio, Irene, de la división en dos bloques del mundo. Las autarquías, por una parte, desde la invasión de Rusia, con la India, incluso Brasil, tantos países, y por otra parte, estamos viendo en este momento las democracias occidentales, para mí con un problema muy especial, que en vez de estar unidas y coordinadas como teníamos que estar, nos hemos, no se dice politizado, no es políticamente correcto, nos hemos polarizado de tal forma que o estás conmigo o estás contra mí. Y a mí me preocupa muchísimo también en las empresas, porque la reputación ahora mismo te está haciendo que se está interrumpiendo mucho el libre comercio. No solamente por la seguridad de abastecimiento, por las cadenas de suministro. Hay mucho más riesgo de estar deshaciendo casi la libertad de comercio, porque a ver en qué país inviertes, si es el friendshoring o no es amigo tuyo, si no tiene tus planteamientos ideológicos inclusive, y tienes realmente que salirte de ahí. Es decir, todo este cúmulo de cosas. No hemos hablado todavía de un riesgo tremendo, y voy saltando a muchos temas porque no me da tiempo de desarrollarlos. El tema de la ciberseguridad. Es un tema para nosotros como en general en los consejos, primero es la estrategia que tenemos que ver desde la geopolítica. En segundo lugar, los temas del ciberriesgo. Estos están afectando porque no hay pyme pequeñita que sea que no tenga también estos riesgos de ciberseguridad en una economía de los datos como estamos. Hasta la guerra hemos visto que se ha hecho ciber. Ya no es las armadas por tierra, mar y aire, que también, pero sobre todo es la cibernética. Esto nos preocupa muchísimo y aquí, mujeres de STEM, que decíamos antes, poneros las pilas porque no hay ese talento digital en este momento. En tercer lugar, tenemos toda la revolución que te he oído muchas veces a ti, Irene, de la inteligencia artificial. ¿Os imagináis la inteligencia artificial, la ciberseguridad, aplicada a las infraestructuras que son claves en todos los países? En el tema del agua, que hablamos poco. Yo he sido ministra de Medio Ambiente y la verdad soy muy sensible a los temas del agua en un país como el nuestro, que tiene sequía en unas partes de España y exceso de agua en otras. Y hay que regularlo con un plan hidrológico que no conseguimos poner en marcha. Son tales los riesgos en este tema de ciberseguridad, de ataque de las infraestructuras, que decimos, hay que aplicar tanto dinero que muchas veces lo que se empezó como una gran necesidad de invertir en una transición verde, que no podemos olvidar, porque esto de la transición verde no es una moda, ha venido para quedarse. Curiosamente ahora, la primera decisión que hay que tomar, ¿dónde ponemos los fondos? ¿Dónde invertimos? Ahora mismo en Europa, en defensa es la clave. Pues yo os quiero recordar que como entidad financiera teníamos prohibido financiar a las empresas de defensa.
Okay.
Ha cambiado el mundo radicalmente.
Yes. We did discuss water, okay, yesterday. But, you know, when you guys were talking about what are the skills needed for board directors going forward, you didn't mention digital. I have to tell you that there are lots of boards with older members who are proud that they're not on social media, who don't know how to use their phones well, you know? And when a board is faced with the Chief Technology Officer's report, how can you provide oversight on that when you don't really understand that whole world, let alone use it on the most basic level? Muriel, the biggest threat, manpower is involved with people's employment. And there are countries like the US where the unemployment rate is so low, yet we're full of jobs that are unfilled. and there's a mismatch between skills and the jobs that are of today.
In fact, in the two boards I am, both are about human capital. Manpower about the workforce, and Galileo Global Education about education at university level. It's the biggest group in the world, 200,000 students, and in 65 campuses in 30 countries. And Manpower is one of the 3 leaders in the world for recruitment and HR advice. And you're right, the mismatch today is already big in US, but also in all Europe, but also in Japan, but most everywhere. There's already a mismatch between the offer and the demand on recruitment. And this will increase because the speed of change, all the surveys say that 1 million jobs are going to be transformed in coming 10 years due to mainly artificial intelligence that creates, destroys, and transforms even more jobs, and also the green transition, because the whole supply chain, for instance, in food industry, in energy, is changing. So when you do both together, it's 1 million jobs. So it's clear that the companies that struggle today to find the resources, it will be more difficult tomorrow. And also in all the North countries, there's a demography which is decreasing. South is increasing, roughly, and the North is decreasing. So there will be not enough people and not with the right qualification. And so the first thing is to advise company not to put out the people who don't have the skills of tomorrow, but to upskill and reskill them because they won't find on the market. So it means that advising company and helping company to upgrade, and typically all employees in the world should have some basic knowledge about AI. Groupe Danone, I'm an advisor about Groupe Danone, like Mercedes for another topic, just decided to create a fund of 100 million euros just to skill about AI 100,000 employees. So this question of the mismatch will be worse. And there's also another mismatch with the relationship to work, which is changing a lot. More purpose-driven, more balance between professional and personal life, the job being maybe the second or equal number one value in life, but not the priority. We spoke this morning about hybrid jobs, these kind of things. This will not come back. So you have not only to find the right skills, but the right expectations, right motivation. And so yesterday, to hire somebody was to select someone. Now it's to seduce someone. It's totally changed. And so this whole mindset has to change. And it's why I would say as well for Manpower and for Galileo Global Education, what is the right education of tomorrow when the skills, the professional skills now, OECD figures, are valid for 2 years in average. It was 30 years ago. Now, what you learn as technical skills is valid 2 years, 8 months in tech. Okay? So how you're going to prepare the students of tomorrow. So in both cases, AI can be a threat, can be a huge opportunity, and people-driven strategy is a key in both cases. But there's a lot to do. And it's very interesting because it's in a way, it puts the human more at the center. But it's to be built in large part.
The individualization of work. Altagracia, in your industry, which is agribusiness, what do you think is the biggest threat nowadays?
So, kind of in agreement with everything that's been said, no? It is more valuable to know how to learn than to know things. But for example, in MINSA, the war with Russia and Ukraine, no, that has 20% of with commodities, fertilizers, corn, and whatnot, That represented to double the cost of corn in a period of 3 months. No, and so inflation was not being controlled in Mexico. The interest rates more than doubled. No, it's the highest interest rate we've had in a long time, and so the president had to call us and the other 14 of the largest companies for basic basket goods, and they asked us to sell below cost for a few months because people couldn't
Wanna repeat
afford.
that?
We had to sell below cost for a few months, and we didn't have to, no, but we agreed to sell. And so when you're in basic basket goods, you almost always do very well, no, but you also know, or you also have to be willing to sometimes take a loss. And for a company, but it's not very, it doesn't come naturally, no, to agree beforehand to it's not even to cut prices, no, pero to sell below, to dump. And so sometimes, again, when you have a company that's not only financially profitable, but that also has a social role, even a political role in the country, you need to know when to do it and how long to do it. No? And so that's, for example, one of the things. No, again, public transportation. If you see our industries, no, we're in the automotive industries. We have 3 plants for thermoform plastic for Tesla, Lucy, John Deere, Greenbrier, and whatnot, Volkswagen, Audi. We have these urban and suburban buses. We construct transmission lines and substations, and pues most of them are in flexible demand. Most of these products and services, except the automotive industry, we do social housing, about 3,000 houses a year. And when you look at each of the challenges that are different, electromobility is one of the big ones, but all of our sectors are very informal. In Latin America, in Mexico, 55% of the economy is informal economy. No?
So what does that mean if it's mostly an informal economy?
So your clients are S&Ms. They usually don't have access to finance, to credit, and so you have a role to play also in finding them a better solution. And so, for example, in 2006, we were the first company to introduce natural gas buses in Mexico. And we have 86% of the market for natural gas before electrical was a reasonable solution, no? Because it was 10 times the cost. And natural gas was 2 times the cost of a diesel bus, but 90% less pollutant. And so when we did that, we had to do a program with the government and with each city in which we introduced that, one for the government to help pay technological differentiation, and 2, we transformed what we called the business model, which was Hombre Camión. It means pues, one person was owner of one bus, into Ruta Empresa. So companies that depended on routes. So because banks couldn't finance a bus that in 5 years is worth nothing, no, because we also have social tariffs for public transportation in Mexico, what we did was the government gave concession on the routes. And so we made every one of the bus owners come together into one big company that could now afford to have credit given to them. And so there is, again, in all of the big challenges, but there are opportunities to transform parts of the system that really make for better societies.
That's amazing. It's sort of like corporate social responsibility as part of growth, not as something on the side that is philanthropy, but rather as a way to negotiate and meet the needs of clients and workers. I think that's fabulous. There's now a greater demand for companies to meet what are called ESG metrics. How do you all feel about that? Brenda?
Well, I'll start. So the way to look at ESG, I think, is to really understand the value it brings, obviously, to the company, and it has to be to the profits and to the business, but it is to the broader society. And that's the shift that we're in. So let's look at it from an impact perspective. There is a sustainable agenda and there is a social agenda. And when you break that down into impact, it's ethical impact, it's obviously environmental impact, but it has to be equitable impact. And that equitable is the social element. So it is important to be at the core of everyone contributing to the future of the world in our commitments to be a carbon-free, carbon-reduced world. And so that's coming into every business process, every supply chain, and into every stakeholder. I think this can't be one person who measures it. It is just not your chief sustainability officer. And this goes into even, when we'll talk a little bit more about AI or other challenges, it's every stakeholder needs to understand their responsibility, from the CEO, CIO, CFO, CMO, all the way through. So it is a transformation of thought, company. There are metrics that help us because, again, you measure what is important, but you also see the impact. And I think it will continue to be a relevant part of the business management, the risk management, and governance. But I'll introduce one concept here. We have basic financial accounting, which is, of course, very important. But there is a new type of accounting for ESG called impact-weighted accounting. It started in Harvard Business School. I know EY and some other auditing companies are starting to look at this. And it's saying, yes, you measure your outcomes and your profit and your, all of the other financial metrics, but how are you measuring the impact to your employees, to the communities, to the world? And you have a responsibility on both sides.
You know, when we had the summit in Tokyo a few years ago, I was so surprised when the CEO of Japan Airlines mentioned to me that after this disaster in which there was a lot of flooding, they were helping farmers to replant and flying in the seeds and actually having people. So it was a very direct kind of CSR. They weren't metrics. It was like direct response that had nothing to do even with philanthropy. It's sort of like what you talked about when the war in Ukraine broke out and the price of corn doubled, and then the government tells you, can you sell at a much lower price to our people? I mean, that's CSR writ large, when public responsibility of a company becomes even much more evident than ever before. Until the Ukraine war, I didn't know Ukraine was the basket, the food basket of the world, that they sent wheat to Latin America, wheat to Africa, and that war meant starvation in some countries because wheat deliveries in the Middle East, like Egypt, they were begging for the shipments to come through. So that's really, I'm just giving you guys a sense of the disasters that companies must deal with on an ongoing basis, as Brenda was talking about. So, Isabel, banks have to deal with metrics not only of disasters, but how do you help and how do you determine when that assistance is needed?
De lo primero que estamos hablando aquí quería sacar la palabra mágica, que es la que tenemos que poner el focus en este momento. Participación público-privada.
Yeah.
Esa es la clave de la que estamos hablando
Yeah.
hace un rato ya y tenemos que ponerle su nombre. Y aquí estamos fallando, en el mundo entero. Porque tú estás hablando de la importancia del ESG. Le hemos dado tal valor a la parte environment que lo tiene, del cambio climático, de todos los desastres de sequías o de inundaciones, etcétera, etcétera, que están produciéndose, que yo voy a hablar por Europa en este momento. La Unión Europea, para mí, se ha pasado en el tsunami regulatorio. tsunami regulatorio total. En los temas de exigencia medioambiental no habíamos aplicado una directiva y ya teníamos 3 más en la puerta llamando. ¿Y qué ha pasado ahora? Que ahora se habla más de la parte de la S, de la parte social. ¿Porque realmente se lo creen? ¿O porque no hay presupuesto para poder pagar todas las exigencias regulatorias, pensando no solamente en las grandes empresas, sino en las pequeñas y medianas empresas? Por eso me preguntas por el papel de las entidades financieras. Las entidades financieras, claro que tenemos muchísima responsabilidad y estamos haciendo, primero, ser ejemplares, los grandes bancos como el Santander, en haber hecho ya esa transición, la Green Transition, y ya somos realmente nosotros de no utilizar papel, del uso eficiente de los recursos naturales, etcétera, etcétera, que no voy a contar, que no he venido a hacer un comercial del Banco Santander. Pero dicho esto, hay un problema muy grave, y me refiero solamente a Europa. La banca en Europa está muy saneada en este momento. Muriel me lo podrá asegurar también. Tuvimos aquella crisis financiera y los balances están saneados, los bancos tienen liquidez, los modelos de negocio han cambiado. Estamos mucho mejor que estuvimos en la crisis del 2006 para afrontar estos retos. Pero ¿qué es lo que ocurre? Que no nos encontramos con un level playing field a la hora de actuar, que no están exigiendo las mismas características a unos bancos y a otros. Y cuando somos bancos que tenemos que competir con otros bancos, miro México, miro Brasil, las exigencias de capital que le están poniendo a la banca, por ejemplo, española, a la banca europea en general, pero a bancos sistémicos como el Banco de Santander, cada vez más capital, te está recortando la liquidez y está llegando al punto que por cumplir todas las exigencias del capital regulatorio no tienes la capacidad de financiar y de ayudar a tantas pequeñas y medianas empresas que no pueden quedarse en el camino, no solamente por aspectos sociales y laborales que estamos todas contemplando, sino porque son los verdaderos elementos tractores de esa situación de transición energética. Hablamos, por ejemplo, de eficiencia energética en España, muchísimo ahora. Cómo hay que cambiar todas las calderas, cómo hay que hacer los edificios que sean mucho más eficientes energéticamente. Tenemos que acudir a pymes. Pymes que se asfixian si no tienen esa capacidad financiera. ¿Pero qué ocurre? ¡Oh, la banca mala, la banca mala! La banca es uno de los sectores más regulados, Irene, como tú muy bien sabes.
In every country.
Exacto. Y entonces, esa regulación en Europa, con la taxonomía verde, hay momentos en que te impiden financiar a según qué empresas, porque están catalogadas en el tsunami regulatorio como empresas brown o en transición. Entonces, tú quieres financiarlas y enseguida tienes al Banco Central Europeo diciéndote que no cumples tus requisitos ambientales. Por eso nosotros no solamente tenemos que financiar a las empresas verdes. Para mí lo más importante es financiar a las que están en transición. Y es lo que estamos haciendo desde el banco. O sea, ayudar muchísimo a los clientes verdes, pero preocuparnos mucho más con unos sectores muy específicos en los que hemos puesto importancia. Tú hablas de la agricultura. Para España la agricultura es clave y estamos financiando enormemente toda la transición ecológica que tiene que hacer el sector agrícola, mucho más en España y en Europa, por las exigencias de la PAC. Entonces, esto lo estamos haciendo, incluso a veces aunque no sean verdes, pero porque les ayudamos a transicionar. Es la parte más importante y para mí esa es la verdadera parte social, de ayudar a pequeñas y medianas empresas. España tiene casi un 94% del sector productivo en pymes, en pequeñas y medianas empresas. Si no las financiamos, pero claro, estamos pidiendo que se levante un poquito, como decimos en España, el pie del acelerador en el tsunami regulatorio.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Que sean comprensivos, que estamos cumpliendo con la taxonomía.
Yeah.
Pero que hay que financiar algunas empresas para que sean verdes, en vez de, si no, como decimos, transición justa y que nadie se quede atrás. Son palabras vacías de contenido. Entonces, eso es lo que estamos trabajando ahora mismo en sectores muy específicos, en economía circular, en todo lo que es el recycling en este momento, el packaging es muy importante, y en eso nosotros como banco tenemos 5 sectores muy importantes que estamos financiando. Bueno, tenemos un presupuesto de 320 billion adentro de 2025 y lo estamos cumpliendo francamente bien porque hay mucha demanda de green transition, de green finance. Y esto no podemos olvidarlo nunca. No es una moda, ha venido para quedarse y en esto va unido el futuro de las nuevas generaciones y de nosotros mismos como empresa, como salud financiera. Los inversores no van a financiarnos, sino. Y te iba a decir una última cosa. Cuando habéis comentado la importancia de la medición, en los criterios del ESG, por lo menos en Europa, el mayor problema lo tenemos, Irene, en la falta de armonía. No hay armonización. Según qué inversor quiera ir a una compañía a invertir, tiene unos parámetros distintos para medir cómo esa compañía está desarrollando la tecnología verde o la sostenibilidad social o qué governance tiene. Y ahí las mujeres tenemos mucho que hacer y termino, porque con esa empatía que tú decías al principio, la transparencia es clave en este momento. Entonces, el tener esa relación con los stakeholders, con los shareholders también, el que a las mujeres nos manden, como yo he tenido el privilegio de hacer, un roadshow con todos los inversores, por ejemplo, del Banco de Santander, fue la asignatura más complicada que creo que he aprobado nunca. Esto es muy importante. Y pedir también que os pongan de presidentas en las comisiones. No hablemos solo de los boards. Y es muy importante estar presidiendo una comisión de auditoría y en una comisión de riesgos. Para mí, ahora mismo, meteros a presidir las comisiones de nombramientos. Ahí hacéis la selección de los próximos consejeros y hacéis la selección de la sucesión. Y esos que dices que no saben manejar el teléfono, refreshment, tienen que marcharse a su casa y dejar paso a mujeres maravillosas.
I asked a European woman entrepreneur one time, I said, why is it that only 30% of small businesses, of pymes in Europe, are women-owned? And she said, the rules to create a business in Europe are so burdensome that it's just, you know, it's so hard to break through the paperwork, the bureaucratic requirements alone to open a business. Whereas, say, in Asia or United States, we have rules in the US, but it's much more entrepreneurially open, you know? In Asia, it's genetic, is my view. They make the rules afterwards. But you do have a point here. It's governance, as you say, is not just on the side of the corporations, it's the governance on the side of governments who may not see that the rules that they have created is actually prohibiting growth as opposed to enabling it. So, Muriel, on this point, you began, when I met Muriel, I read about her. That's why I invited her, because Danone had created a partnership with the Grameen Bank. And I loved the circularity of it, you know, and it was in a project in Bangladesh. And it enabled Danone products to be made in the country and to be sold in the country in the way they normally do so, door to door. But anyway, tell me about corporate responsibility as you see it now.
I'm fully convinced that something is changing. Companies realize more and more that their perimeter of responsibility, their definition, their existence is not their legal definition. It's their whole ecosystem. Their supply chain, their stakeholders, their customers, their consumers, their community depend on them, but they depend on them too.
Yeah.
And in crisis time, you see it even more. And you mentioned also in Japan, when there was a Hiroshima, not Hiroshima, sorry. When there was a Fukushima crisis, I was leading this crisis management for Danone, and we decided to help the farmers, because to do yogurt, as you can imagine, they are farmers. And in the biggest factory was between Fukushima and Tokyo, so they couldn't, for a while, they couldn't do farming anymore. So we made a huge program to help them to reskill in vegetables farms, and we help them to settle, to own lands in other parts of Japan. This has changed the game of our business in Japan after. We did it for solidarity, and in fact, it was the best business investment because it creates a link with our supply chain, with the government, with the community, with the public opinion, which changed dramatically. And this kind of example, I can see it in many companies, because especially in crisis time. But this should not be only in crisis time. ESG, before to be regulations, ESG means just that your company, it's a whole ecosystem with stakeholders, and that your success is linked to their success. If they are their employees, customers, suppliers, communities, authorities, all count. That's the first thing, and I think this is moving in the right direction. It's why today, it's a good thing, it's very dangerous for a company to do greenwashing or social washing. It's a boomerang. It doesn't work anymore. And young people are tackling that very quickly. So that's more the good side.
Wait, tell them what greenwashing means.
Greenwashing means you pretend to be greener because you ask people to close the electricity when they quit the office, or they paperless. I know you don't much more than that. But in fact, at the same time, their investments, their strategy is exactly the opposite. So it's very difficult to be consistent on that, because transitioning is difficult, and in a way, all companies are in the brown spectrum, in a way. It's very difficult, especially in some sector where energy is very important. But don't pretend to be more than you are. That's very dangerous, because people don't accept to be this lie anymore, and I think it's good, because with social networks and with young people, especially on the environment part, it's visible very quickly. You can check very quickly if it's true or not. And so don't pretend to be more. Claim what you are doing, what you intend to do tomorrow, show the progress, but don't say you are perfectly clean, because it's counterproductive. And the same for the social. My concern today is a bit about regulation. I agree with you that regulation is good, because you don't progress if you don't measure, like for gender equality. But at the same time, on the European side, we are a little bit on the other side. First, if we're the only one to do that in the world, it's good to be in advance, but it means we should have the same demand for products that we import in Europe, because otherwise we have a lot of cost to green and social advanced level in Europe, but we'll import at a low cost products that have been made in a very badly condition from a ecology and social perspective. So that's the first point. Yep. The second point, we make sure that the regulation, the criteria, the indicators are not too complex for the SME, and we are on the edge today, even a little more, I think, for the SMEs. And the third one is, as you say, how we value the transition, not only the best ones, because for instance, many companies will not be able to do what we have decided to do at European level. Of course, we would like to be quicker, but it's not by beating them that will work. We have to support the transition strongly. And finally, I would say that I think ESG also, it's a fantastic opportunity to reconcile youth with companies, because many young people want to work in a purpose-driven company. And if you don't pretend, if you are really committed to communities, to the greening transition, to social conditions, and at the same time you are able to do a very good business, sustainable, innovative, and many women are leading that, is very good. It's why I will support. Of course, in a committee of nomination, succession planning is the key, but it's good also to go in ESG committee, because from a strategic perspective, being at the core of the strategy and not outside.
I want to give an example of what Muriel was talking about in terms of ensuring that even your vendors in your supply chain follow the same regulations. A lot of labels, clothing labels in the US and Europe, depend on production in countries like Bangladesh. There was a big fire in one of those factories. The doors were locked, and they locked them so that they'll just keep working. The women, and they were all women, couldn't escape. And it was so tragic. They all died that the whole world raised their voices, and then the brands, branding. Branding is critical. And with social media, immediately they can blame and say, so then the companies had to create rules about how they apportion contracts and how they supervise, those contracts to ensure that workers are treated well, that the products are what they say they are, etc.
May I just add one thing, Irene, in this direction? All of us also, not only as people working in companies or for companies, but as consumers who have a huge power, and especially women who are leading the consuming brands, the consumption brand. And I give an example. A few years ago, you remember that Nike was attacked because some of the product was made by children. The value of the company dropped dramatically. The sale dropped dramatically. They have fixed it. Now they are leading groups of other companies for the whole industry to be cleaner. So let's also be coherent, consistent when we buy.
Grace, Mexico is now one of the largest trading partners of the United States. And because of proximity between U.S. and Mexico, what are some of the U.S. practices that have filtered down in terms of governance, in terms of management, that you feel have been beneficial or not?
Mexico became actually the United States' largest trade partner last year. So we're now a more important partner even than China. No, and this decade, no, for a region, an economic region that is with over 30% of the global GDP, which is Canada, United States, and Mexico. But there have been many challenges and many benefits to it. And in this decade, but there's a new way of globalization, which is regionalization, nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, whatever. And then there's a new way of understanding capitalism. Capitalism hadn't been, was really challenged in a while, no? Maybe since 91, maybe since 89. And this new way to understand capitalism does put up front the environmental and the social and even the governance impacts that investments have. And so Mexico being one of the largest recipients, no, of these nearshoring trend can also be one of the largest promoters of this new capitalism trend. And,
Is that good or bad, or, in
no,
your
it
estimation?
is very good. It is very good. The challenge here, and Isabel mentioned it, is how do we get it down to the ground? No, in Mexico, our stock market, for example, only has about 130 companies. No, and so 94% of our companies are small and medium businesses, and it's 90-something% that are family-owned businesses. So if you want to change how business is done in Mexico, you need to change how families work in Mexico.
Ah, very good point. Did you all hear that? It's actually not just in Mexico. No. In many parts of the world.
In the whole world.
Philippines.
76% of new jobs are family-owned businesses in the world. And even these large stock market companies, you know, they're family-owned, or a chunk of them are family-owned.
Or began like that.
Founders. No? And so when you see the gender gap, or when you see the lack of accountability, or when you see, there's a gender gap, but there's also a dream gap. No? These girls are not being given the opportunity to dream, to become something different. There is a gap in preparation for girls in Mexico, especially in the southern part of Mexico. There's also a lack of aspiration of most girls to become anything more than a mom.
Did you hear her? A dream gap. I love it. How to envision bigger than the life you already know.
And so I do think that being close to the U.S. again, and having not only closeness in trade, but also having almost 40 million Mexican Americans living in the United States, pues we're more connected through more than trade, no? Culturally, even socially. And so there are things to gain from that, and we need to find a way to share our virtues and disencourage our defects, no, in both societies. And I do think that one of the major opportunities to look forward to is that for a long time we've been teaching leaders to beat the odds, but we haven't been teaching them to change the odds. And I think it is a very good opportunity.
Very good. Very good. Wonderful. Wonderful.
If may I slot think,
Sure.
es muy importante lo que estás diciendo en el sentido de que estamos hablando, sin decir el nombre una vez más, de reputación. Todos los temas que estáis abordando ahora en Europa van por una vía, yo que parece que antes siendo jurista parece que he ido contra la legislación, nada más erróneo, no estoy en contra de la ley, pero precisamente es muy bueno cómo en la Unión Europea hemos puesto la transparencia y la reputación por encima de todo. Y el reporting, que no hemos hablado en ESG, el reporting ahora mismo es clave. Por eso yo decía que me preocupaba la falta de armonización en las métricas. ¿Cómo podemos medir si este inversor hoy te valora más, si tienes más mujeres o menos, y mañana no le importa nada este tema y te valora otra cosa distinta? Entonces, el tema de reputación, lo que tú has preguntado antes de Bangladesh, ¿qué ha pasado? Esa compañía no volvería a abrir nunca más las puertas. Con lo cual, hoy en día, el reporting y esa transparencia es tan importante que es que va a la cuenta de resultados, una vez más. A mí me desespera que todavía se llaman riesgos no financieros. Y yo me canso de decir qué es lo más financiero que hay en una compañía. En España pusimos en marcha, hoy ya no está en vigor porque la directiva cambió, la ley de información no financiera. Y cuando yo decía que era lo más financiero, claro, como tú has sido ministra de Medio Ambiente, digo, no, es que la salud financiera de las compañías, el que una compañía pueda tener inversores que la sostengan, va a depender de cómo cumple estos criterios de environment, de social, que tú estás comentando tanto, y el governance, que parece la hermanita pequeña. Y si fuéramos transparentes en el governance, y eso empieza en el board, otro gallo nos cantara en temas de corrupción, ¿no? Ahí me quedo.
Thank you, Isabel. Just very quickly, we have little time left. I love the passionate way they talk, you know, whether it's Mercedes from France or Isabel from Spain. Somehow it all sounds different. Anyway, with the little time we have left, just very quickly, you know, we talked about all the challenges of being on a board, the challenges that companies face on which you serve. I want to hear what you enjoy about being a board member. Quickly, Brenda.
Oh, having an impact in the future. It isn't about looking at the past. It's about addressing this on the true purpose of enriching lives, taking them forward, and seeing, yes, the product, the manufacturing, the people, all the supply chain, but at the end of the day, are you creating are you having an impact on society? And I look at it as that.
You view it that way.
I view it that way.
Isabel.
Pues yo estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que está comentando ella, pero para mí lo primero me motiva a seguir siendo muy independiente. Las mujeres somos mucho más independientes en los consejos de administración que los hombres.
No, I agree.
Y es un tema que no me quería ir a casa sin decirlo, porque el futuro de las compañías va de la sinceridad. Si defendemos a los minoritarios y no somos sinceros porque, como diga esto, no me van a renovar, pues bendito, a lo mejor eres tú la que te vas antes y no pasa nada porque ganas en tu branding. Esto hay que tener esa libertad y esa independencia. Y yo he mantenido, ya me veis que soy un poco rebelde, con lo cual he mantenido mi independencia siempre. Y en los boards en los que estoy y en los que he estado, también. En segundo lugar, a mí me apasiona aprender todos los días.
Yeah.
Y los consejos me motivan muchísimo.
Always.
Solamente el paquete de documentación que te llega, aunque ahora sea digital, en la época cuando yo empecé lo medíamos al peso, cuántos kilos te mandaban de documentación a casa. Bueno, pues la realidad es que se aprende todos los días y te das cuenta de todo lo que te falta. Por tanto, es un challenge que a lo mejor en un puesto directivo estás tan obsesionada por lo que tienes que hacer para pasado mañana que no tienes el open minding que necesitamos ahora mismo en tantos riesgos geoestratégicos. Y luego, efectivamente, modestamente, creo que, máxime, cuando las mujeres en los consejos muy independientes nos ponemos todas a mover la aguja de marear en la misma dirección, no hay quien se nos resista. Por tanto, ser independientes, ser muy libres, tener muchísimo rigor profesional es lo que os va a dar el éxito en vuestra vida. No os canséis nunca de estudiar, de avanzar. Es el modesto consejo que os puedo dar ya de viejecita, de abuela de 25 nietos que soy. Creo que es importante el no parar de aprender nunca. Y a mí los consejos me motivan todo eso. Y doy las gracias a los consejos y a la gente con la que estoy.
Absolutely agree. But Isabel, you have earned your independence, okay? It does matter that you have had significant executive and corporate leadership experience. When you're a brand new director, you can't quite be as independent. You have to sort of figure out within committees or creating alliances when you make a point about changing something. Muriel, what do you like about being a board director?
First, like Isabel, I've always been independent as a person, and now I'm legally independent director, so I like that. This freedom, at the same time, the freedom and the accountability to use your brain, your experience, your connection to help a team. It's like a transmission also. Transmission for me, the same. I've been leading transformation now, more on the helping other to take the lead. And that's fantastic experience to help an executive team, a CEO, to take the lead in a transformation world and helping him and her to have a 360 views to projecting the future, it's like be a little bit a grand cousin and an aunt. you are, and I think it's a fantastic way, certainly when you're young, but when you're senior, you can transmit by learning, by questioning, and by supporting, by challenging. So it's a very, very nice experience in life.
Great. Grace, what do you love about being a chairman of the board?
Pues first that I'm chairwoman. No,
Oh,
we're not
chairwoman.
And so we get to change many things. And if we go back to the fundamentals of any company, which is the ability to add value, no? The ability to solve needs, that's what they pay us to do. And so to have the power to do that, I think is the best thing in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you for that insight. Thank you. Well, you can't ask for more, right? We got these kinds of women on boards. Wow.